Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Friends and Allies, Frank Murphy and the Jewish Community in Michigan and Beyond with Greg Zipes. As you all know, this is a three-part program, with tonight being our first part. Please note the Zoom link that you received yesterday evening is the same Zoom link you will use for all three parts of the program. And we will be sure to send out reminders for this next week and before our session on the 19th. Also on January 20th, we have a very special conversation conducted by Barbara Cohn with artist Yigal Ozeri and his daughter Shir, and we hope that you will all join us for that. As I said before, this evening we have with us Greg Zipes. He is going to be presenting his presentation, Friends and Allies, Frank Murphy in the Jewish community in Michigan and Beyond. Mr. Zipes is a Stanford University graduate and has a degree in law from UCLA, and has written the book Justice and Faith, the Frank Murphy Story. Over the next 3 weeks, he will be talking us through Frank Murphy's life and relationship with the Jewish community. And without further ado, please welcome Greg Zipes.
Thank you very much, Kara. I hope you can hear me okay right now. And I'm going to put something up on the screen. Hopefully this works. I'm going to share a screen with you. So thank you very much. I am very pleased to be presenting to you. I should put two matters on the table immediately. The first is to address the elephant in the room and say that Frank Murphy was not Jewish. He was a proud Catholic and of Irish extraction. He lived from 1890 to 1949, so about 59 years old when he died. And the second is that he was unquestionably one of Michigan's most important politicians and jurists. And as will become obvious, I hope, I developed a great deal of respect for him. Here he is at the Michigan governor's desk in 1937 or so on the right, and to the left is a little plug for my book. One thing you'll notice about him is that he has noticeably bushy eyebrows that are hard to miss, and that he was also a redhead, which you can't necessarily pick up in these black and white pictures. He's most famous for his dissent in Korematsu versus United States, Supreme Court case during the World War II era. And we'll get into this more, but Japanese Americans were interned. About 120,000 were sent to internment camps in central United States, away from their homes on the West Coast, without any due process, without any individualized hearings. And they were sent en masse. And this matter made its way to the Supreme Court at the end of World War II, after most of the damage was done to the community. And Frank Murphy was famous for his dissent. He lost. Dissent means that he lost, but he said, this is racist and this does not represent what's best about this country. So in this three-part lecture, I'm going to explore Murphy's connections to the Jewish community and beyond. I've given numerous lectures on Murphy, but none with a focus on a particular religious or ethnic group. And let me tell you, this lecture will be a bit of a challenge for me, and maybe for you as well, because the topic is specialized in certain ways. What I hope you'll see is that Murphy and his allies, Jewish and otherwise, found common cause in promoting a certain vision of America, one that stressed religious inclusiveness, a strong nod towards making sure everyone lived with dignity and with enough food on their plates, and a welcoming attitude towards immigrants and the traditionally oppressed. So as a Catholic, Murphy was vocal in condemning anti-Semitism, both in the United States and abroad, particularly as the storm clouds gathered in Europe in the late 1930s. You may be familiar with Father Cochlin and be surprised to hear this about a Catholic in the public spotlight who was a contemporary of Murphy. And that we'll certainly discuss Murphy's relationship with Father Cochlin. The two men were close, but like at a Passover table where we might have a relative who has a certain political point of view or religious sensitivity that doesn't comport to our own, Catholic community had the same, and it had Frank Murphy on one end of the spectrum and Father Cochlin on the other end of the spectrum. This is the United States. No one religion controls and no single vision controls. And by exploring Murphy, I hope to also explore what it means to be Jewish in this country as well. And I look forward to having that discussion with you. I'm going to be referring to certain terms that may be unfamiliar to you. In certain instances, you're going to be more familiar than me. I'm a New Yorker. I'm speaking to you from New York. You might hear some sirens from New York City outside every once in a while. I've spent time in Detroit and in Harbor Beach, which is Frank Murphy's home. Behind me is from a kayaking trip. Behind my own screen is from a kayaking trip on Lake Huron, right in Harbor Beach, which is about 120 miles north of Detroit. And I encourage you all to go up there and visit, because that's where his home, Frank Murphy's home museum is. But if I'm using certain terms that are not familiar to you, by all means, let Kara know about that, and I'll try to address them. For example, some of you might not know who Father Cochlin is, and I will certainly address that. So before I go on, let me just say that I'm a lawyer, and so I have to give a lawyerly disclaimer. I have a day job, and anything I say tonight shouldn't be construed as a position of my employer. This talk and my book are based on my own research and my own opinions. And you'll hear that I do have opinions, which may not comport with your opinions. The second is that we'll delve into sensitive subjects: race, religion, gender. Frank Murphy was a bachelor. There were questions about his sexuality. And note that definitions change over time. I may employ words that you find offensive, or you may find are too politically correct. And just I'll ask that we be humble about that, and again, we can have the discussion if you think I'm using terms that are offensive in some way. One example I'll give you right off the bat is that I do refer to the internment camps as concentration camps at times, so the Japanese American camps, and quite rightly so. Concentration camps in the Jewish community, which we're all part of, has connotations. I did have a discussion with a daughter of a survivor of the internment camps in Japanese American internment camps. She told me she likes the word concentration camp for the Japanese American internment camps during World War II. And I said, what about the concentration camps in Europe? And she said, those were death camps. Those are death camps. And so again, definitions are tricky, and I'm just throwing that out there. So I'm going the wrong way. So okay. So let's start about 1937. It was around this time. It was in the winter time, and I spoke about Murphy's bushy eyebrows. I'm going to play a newsreel from 1937, and this will take us back to the labor strikes in Flint that broke out just as Murphy was assuming the governorship of the state of Michigan. And I'll go into greater detail in the future, but know that this was during the Great Depression, and New Deal legislation of Roosevelt was being routinely overturned by the Supreme Court, to FDR's great consternation. Murphy was a great ally of the New Deal and a great ally of Roosevelt, and Roosevelt relied on him in many ways. Murphy was central for this during the strikes that broke out in Michigan. Michigan obviously being the center of the car industry and industry generally in the United States. So anything that happened in Michigan and Detroit had an outside influence on labor issues in the country. But no one knew at the time whether the Supreme Court would uphold the New Deal legislation dealing with labor issues. There was a new regime that FDR was attempting to put in place. It was called collective bargaining. And again, we'll discuss that a little bit more, but no one was sure if the Supreme Court would uphold the collective bargaining. And there was a standoff in Flint and many other cities. Flint was the most famous. Armed camps. There was the strikers inside the buildings, and there was their families and other laborers streaming into Michigan from across the country. And on the other side was management and its people trying to get the factories up and running. And there were all sorts of political implications, and it was a tinderbox. So I'm just going to play this clip that from 1937. You'll hear a British sounding guy giving the introduction. This is from the BBC, but you'll soon hear Frank Murphy's voice, and you'll see his bushy eyebrows as well. He's clearly exhausted in this, but we'll discuss this right after. So let me play that.
So by now, after 2 weeks of strike, Flint was an armed camp with 2,000 militia, keeping both sides apart. The press and the cameras were obviously there too, and Governor Murphy went on the newsreels.
We are not going to settle this strike by force and violence. There isn't going to be mob rule here. We will work our way out of this strike peacefully and without injustice to anyone. And I am confident that after it's all over with, there will be a better understanding between employer and employee. And better still, I hope that conditions will be improved under which men and women labor and live.
Okay, so by this time, Murphy was as governor, was in contact with President Roosevelt and Labor Secretary Frances Perkin, the first female secretary in a cabinet position, advising them of Michigan. FDR was staying safely in the background. He was involved, but he was staying in the background, and Murphy was getting all the pressure to settle this. And you'll see that he's walking a fine line here. He mentions mob rule, which is a nod to those who are very afraid that this labor strike was a communist takeover. And he also mentions that the strike will be settled peacefully, which was central in his view. It needed to be settled centrally. And I think that's one of his great legacies, that generally these strikes were settled peacefully. But at the end, he tips his hand as he speaks of the working conditions of the workers. We'll talk about this strike in more detail, but for now, just note that United States history could have followed a very different path if the workers were crushed through force. If governors like Murphy didn't say that the strikes would be resolved peacefully, and if he didn't send in the National Guard to separate the two sides, lawlessness and violence might have ensued. And there were Jews involved with the strike, notably Morris Sugar, who we'll discuss more in the next lecture, and we'll mention him a little bit here as well. He was representing the UAW, which was a brand new union at the time. And we'll discuss him again in the next lecture, but he was crucial, and their personal ties were crucial in settling the strike. So to understand how Murphy ultimately got to his position on the Supreme Court with Korematsu, again, that was after he was governor and after these strikes in Michigan, we need to start from the beginning of Frank Murphy's life. And I promise to move quickly through this. He was born in 1890, as I stated. Harbor Beach is in the Mitten area of Michigan, which if you look at, as you guys know, if you look at Lake Huron, it looks like a mitten. And Harbor Beach is about 120 miles north of Detroit. And it was unlike a small town that you'd associate in the Midwest today. And I'm talking generally, but it was, it had many first generation Americans, not like today when you go to a small town, it's filled with people who've been living there for a long time and generations who have been living there. And again, I'm grossly generalizing, but Harbor Beach had up to a third of its entire population of about 1,200 was not even born in this country. So you had new immigrants, and Murphy's family, along with others, was thrown together in this mix. You could see from this house on the right, and it's now a museum and you can visit it, and I hope you do, but this is a house that Murphy grew up in, and he grew up in a fairly privileged background. The prior owner of the house was a Maine citizen of the town of Harbor Beach. He owned the local factory, and he had actually strung the first electric lines from the factory, which is right on Lake Huron, and there's still some form of it today, up to this house where Murphy was born and lived, and it was the first electrified house in Harbor Beach. So as I mentioned, Frank Murphy is Catholic. His family was proudly Catholic, and he was very attached to his mother. You could see Frank in this photo to the left, and he's there in the appropriate garb. His mother, Mary, was born in upstate New York and came to what was then Sand Beach, now called Harbor Beach, at an early age. She sang in the Catholic and Baptist churches. And I'll pause right here because although Murphy was a devout Catholic, Catholics were a distinct minority in this town, and they mixed with others. There was no Catholic school. He went to public school. He was on the baseball team. He was on the football team, and he faced very little religious discrimination at this local level. And as such, he got a certain taste growing up of what America is. So his America was basically a tolerant one, different groups mixed together. That was what he was used to growing up in this small town. And I should touch on Harbor Beach for a moment, because it got its name because it's obviously a port. The harbor, it was a federal project, and boats would come from Lake Superior down to the already heaving industrial areas by Detroit. They had to pass this way, and the Great Lakes, as you know, can be perilous. They especially as winter approaches and they start icing over, but also the waves are huge. And so there was a need for a safe harbor, and Harbor Beach was chosen. The federal government back then, you should keep in mind, it's not like today. It didn't have the responsibilities that it has today. There's no Social Security building back then. They didn't do Social Security. They didn't generally look after the destitute or the unemployed. But one thing the federal government did do was try to build up the rivers and waterways in the country. And Frank Murphy's at a very young age, would have seen a successful federal project right outside his door. You could say Lake Huron down the way. And I'm bringing that up partly because as we try to figure out why he became a New Dealer, why he became someone who was generally in favor of the federal government getting active in helping build infrastructure and helping unemployed and that sort of thing. This had its effect on him as he was growing up. But I should also note that Frank Murphy, his father was an attorney. His father wanted to instill a sense of purpose in him, and he put him to work in the factory. He actually made him go to the factory. He worked from 7 a.m. until 6 p.m. summers. And these are not the factories that you would see today. They would get hot. It would be 140 degrees. He would have to, they were dangerous. He saw how other workers lived, and it had a great effect on him. He felt a connection to the working person, which really carried through the rest of his life. So this is inside Frank Murphy's house, which is again a museum. And another factor that contributed to Murphy's later leanings, in addition to being a minority Catholic, I think in a generally tolerant town, was that Murphy was a Democrat, and Murphy's father was a Democrat in a Republican area. And anybody who has studied Michigan politics knows that generally Michigan was a Republican state. Detroit was elected Republican mayors. That was right up until really the 1930s. There are exceptions to that, but he grew up in a very Republican area. It's still a very Republican area for that matter, but his father was connected to the Democratic Party. And so this meant that any time on a national stage when a Democrat won, they would pass out favors to his father. And Murphy benefited from that because his father was so well connected to the Democratic establishment in Michigan. His father believed in patronage, the patronage system. Murphy rejected that completely. So I haven't really mentioned the Jewish community yet, and that there's a good reason for that. He had very little contact with Jews during his childhood. And I'll divert here, as I will at other times, to state that there was a Jewish presence close to Harbor Beach. a Jewish agricultural community. And you can read about it in the Michigan Jewish Historical Society online library. So I'm giving a plug for that. The place was called Palestine and is close to one of the best named towns, in my view, in the United States, Bad Axe, about 15 miles from Harbor Beach. You go inland a little bit and you're there. The author of this 1964 article put the word Jewish farmers in quotations. You'll see that, I think, if you hone in on it. The article describes the people in the agricultural community as peddlers from the old country with no farming experience. And these Jewish collective agricultural movements died out in this country, but survive in Israel's kibbutzim and moshavim. That there was a sense back in the 1890s that you can start these agricultural communities, and it tied into the utopian background of some of the movements in the United States as well. So this is a riff. I'm not necessarily saying this affected Murphy at all. I just thought it was interesting. This was happening about 15 miles outside of Harbor Beach as he was growing up. So with that diversion, let's return to Murphy. He left Harbor Beach without a lot of contact with Jews, but with a sense that he had a right to be at the American political table and be a part of the American fabric. That's what Harbor Beach gave to him, and the small town gave to him. He went to law school at the University of Michigan, undergraduate and law school at the University of Michigan, as did his father. And he opened up a law office in Harbor Beach for a short time, which is still there if you again get up to Harbor Beach. He didn't stay there for long because the beginning of his career coincided with World War I, and Murphy volunteered for the Army Reserves within a week after the United States declared war on Germany in June of 1917. He was an officer in the Army, but spent much of his time on the home front. He was a brilliant orator. People wanted to hear him. You could hear that in his voice a little bit back when I played it. He had a voice made for radio. He was very clear in how he spoke, and he was mesmerizing. And so he was employed by the Army to sort of go around the Midwest and go into country clubs and pitch the war. We look back on World War I today as a war that everybody got behind in the United States. It was fairly controversial at the time, and we're gonna get back to Morris Sugar and his the fact that he refused to enlist in the Army in World War I, leading to a criminal complaint against him and a disbarment. He was also a lawyer, but Murphy wanted to fight. He had this gung-ho feeling about the United States, and he ended up meeting a lot of people as he was talking in these country clubs. He met a lot of influential people, and again, I'm just trying to build up to how he became what he was later on. He was building connections wherever he went. But his speeches were interesting, and there are speeches that survived from when he was talking during World War I. He focused on the uniqueness of America, words that were to echo in his speeches and writings throughout his life, most notably later in the Korematsu descent. But in the YMCA in Ann Arbor, he described the building as a place where everyone rubs elbows, where creeds and race differences are leveled and the seeds of democracy are sown. And this is the way he talked. You could hear that a little bit back on the clip that I played. He talks about in idealistic, optimistic ways. And so, as I mentioned, Morris Sugar was the UAW chief counsel, and he was a Jew from Brimley, Michigan, which is really far out in the hinterland in Michigan. His father was a first generation, you can call him a peddler. He was someone who sold goods and was in this small town. And that's where Morris Sugar grew up. He also went to the University of Michigan and got his law degree there as well. So Murphy and Sugar didn't know each other in law school, but Murphy and Sugar met each other after Murphy came back from World War I and was practicing in Detroit, even though Murphy was completely in favor of the war, Sugar was a conscientious objector, and he wasn't allowed to practice law. Murphy insisted on representing Sugar in the early 1920s before either of them were anything, and to get him reinstated before the bar of Michigan, and he succeeded in that. It was the same people who disbarred Sugar. Murphy got him reinstated. And I point that out partly just to show what Murphy's character was, but also it sets the stage as to why they cooperated later on during the great sit-down strikes of 1937, which we'll get to. So I want to start to focus a little bit on Murphy's formative professional years. Again, this is a photo of Murphy standing out in front of his house in Harbor Beach. It was a house that he returned to his entire life. It was a place of refuge for him, and he and his brothers and sister often returned to Harbor Beach. They loved that area. But after the war, World War I, we hit a pivot point for Murphy's life. He was coming back to Detroit, and the question was, what was he going to do? He was a bright lawyer, and Detroit was booming. It was booming in ways that is hard to even conceive today. Detroit is coming back, but it had a larger population then than it does now, and maybe not in the early 1920s, but certainly by the 1930s when Murphy was active there. He had already impressed the business elite, and just as one example, Walter Chrysler, that's the Walter Chrysler of Chrysler, offered him the job as general counsel in the Chrysler Corporation. He could have entered the Detroit business community and he could have made a lot of money. And he actually did become the godfather of Chrysler's grandchildren. But instead, he pivoted towards public service. He obtained a job as an assistant United States attorney in Detroit after World War I, and he went into public service. And again, I mentioned the United States government wasn't involved in as many things as it is today. The office was much smaller than it was today, but he was representing the federal government. And he tackled three main jobs as in his new role as an attorney general working for the government. The first was prohibition. Prohibition was now on the books after World War I, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But the federal government, it was a federal mandate, and so the federal government attorneys were involved with enforcing prohibition in Detroit, and you probably know how well that went. The second was the Red Scare. So we had, after World War I, during World War I, a revolution in Russia. The Soviet Union was established and the communist system was put in place. And there was a panic and scare in the United States that the communists were taking over. So the government was involved with that. The federal government was involved with that. The third was graft, resulting from corporate, we'll call it greed during World War I. There was workers' wages were frozen during World War I, but a lot of companies continued to make a lot of money, and there was a sense of outrage among ordinary citizens that this was happening. So he was involved with that. Murphy was a great trial attorney. He really was able to captivate crowds, and people would come to watch him orate. It was said that his voice could project through large chambers. When he was at University of Michigan, he was someone who chanted cheers for the University of Michigan football team, and he was able to yell, and everybody would hear him. So he was universally successful at the United States Attorney's Office, winning almost all his cases. There was one case that it was a hung jury, and that was the only one that he lost. So let me focus on the Red Scare a little bit, because this will touch on the Jewish community and Frank Murphy's connections there. So Detroit, this is after World War I and after the founding of communist Soviet Union. And one thing the federal government did was to crack down on communists after World War I. I'll briefly mention the Palmer raids because the raids had an effect on Murphy. The year was 1919, right after World War I, and Palmer was the Attorney General of the United States, and he was known as a pacifist. He was a Quaker and a pacifist, but the Palmer House residence was bombed by anarchists, and he changed to almost overnight, and he now supported the rounding up of communists by federal agents. It happened with little or no due process, but in Detroit, where Murphy was working, the Palmer raids were particularly dramatic. There was a place called the House of the Masses in Detroit. It was communist, a communist organization, and I can't really get into all the various permutations of communists and socialists that were in the United States, but there were quite a few different variations. There was a House of Masses, and one day in 1919, over 800 men were arrested in the House of the Masses, and without warrants, and they were just rounded up and thrown into federal jail in Detroit. Some of them were arrested just because they were in a cafe on the first floor of the building. And Murphy, as the government attorney, would have seen the frantic wives and children who were trying to find their loved ones. And I mention this because Murphy had a role in prosecuting these men. And later, when he wrote the World War II era dissent, focusing on the injustice of the collective punishment taken against Japanese Americans on the West Coast, I think he had the Palmer raids in the back of his head as he was writing that. The lack of due process. It's not necessarily that he was against prosecuting people, traitors, and people who were going after the country or acting inappropriately. It was that he was a big due process person, and each person has a right to a trial. So I mentioned that, and I assumed that there would be some Jewish ringleaders that would be tied up with this event in the House of the Masses. But in fact, as I looked at this, the Jewish presence in the House of Masses did not seem particularly strong. Let me explain why I did assume there might be a large Jewish presence that was arrested here. I'm a New Yorker. I grew up in upstate New York, Poughkeepsie, New York, and Temple Bethel and Poughkeepsie. And I have a strong education about the New York City population of Jews. New York City had a large Jewish population, both in number and proportion to other groups in New York City. My dad grew up in Brooklyn in a very densely populated Jewish area by Ebbets Field. The Brooklyn Dodgers were his team. And New York had up to 1.75 million Jews by the 1920s. And it was the center of culture and the center of a lot of different things. And so people who rose to the top in New York were sometimes nationally known and oftentimes nationally known. It also had a critical mass of Jews working in certain trade industries, and Jews were involved with unions, and they were involved with the Communist Party in New York. And the Forward, which was a Yiddish newspaper, I think it still has some Yiddish in it, but it's now English. It had a masthead that said "Workers of the World Unite." This was a newspaper that had 250,000 subscribers, and so New York City had a massive a Jewish presence, and also Jews who were active in the labor movement, in socialism and communism. And I sort of assumed that would pass over to Detroit. I should also note that New York had a traumatic event, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, that killed many young Jewish women, and we shouldn't forget the Italian women as well, that traumatized and galvanized many Jews to unionize in New York City. And so again, all this would lead me to conclude that the Jews would be arrested en masse in the House of Masses of the Palmer raids, and it just didn't happen. There wasn't a strong Jewish presence. And so at this point, I should mention the Jewish community in Detroit. And many of you probably know this better than I, but in 1920, the Jewish community was around 35,000 or so Jews in Detroit. And this is according to a memo I'm showing you on the slide, a memo of Murphy's, a memo that Murphy prepared when he was starting to run for office. So you can see the Jewish presence here is not that great in a city that was already about a million people. This number is probably too low because I think the numbers that I read is that there were up to 85,000 Jews in Detroit. And we have to keep in mind that immigration basically stopped in 1924 with the Immigration Act there. So the UJC survey of 1923 said that there appears to be no Jewish labor consciousness in Detroit. And while that lack of labor Jewish class consciousness may have been pervasive, organized Jewish groups did exist, like the Jewish Community Council and the Workmen's Council and other groups in Detroit. The point here is simply that Michigan Jews did not have a strong socialist and communist background in the way that New York Jews did. And I'm bringing that up because, again, Murphy is going to soon have a lot of contact with Jews in Detroit and Michigan, and I'm setting the table for that. One other point that I would put forward is that Detroit was more of a frontier town in the sense Jews in New York were in New York. They considered themselves to be New Yorkers. I think Jews in Detroit, like other people, had a more of a frontier mentality. And if Detroit wasn't working for them, they moved on. And that has its consequences for the types of groups that develop in a certain city and town. Okay, so now we arrive at Murphy's first political run in Detroit in 1922. He's now coming from Harbor Beach and he's established himself in Detroit. He was approximately 31 years old and he announced his run for the recorder's office, which is the official name for Detroit's criminal court. I'll just call it the criminal court because it's easier to refer to it that way. He had a certain protean presence. And this is a great example, this article, which you can see on the wall. This is from the wall of his house and museum. It's something he hung up himself on the wall of his house, his first victory. And you can see that his photo is featured on this, even though it was a full run election. The mayor of Detroit was elected. He doesn't get his photo on the first page. It's Murphy, the young superstar who's running for office. And he just had that kind of charisma from a very young age. And he's now, everybody knows him as a great speaker. He worked with women, he worked with minorities to get himself elected, and he worked with veterans as well. So, so now he's going to start running into Jews, and he's got a choice to make here. Jews are, as I just mentioned, are not a huge population in Detroit. Detroit had the KKK, and it had a lot of whites coming up from the South who were prejudiced. It had segregated housing, and Jews were not allowed to live in certain areas. They weren't allowed to have certain jobs as well. And there was a lot of prejudice against them, and they were a small population. So if you're going to be a cynical politician, you might not be around them as much as others. You might not disown them, but you won't spend time. Murphy, as always, threw himself behind the Jews in Detroit as a judge. He's a criminal court judge, but he's also a politician. He's looking to expand his base of support in ways that might not be appropriate today. He's meeting with Jewish representatives, and this is Murphy in the presence of important Jewish leaders. The international head of the Jewish National Fund is going into Detroit, and Murphy's standing there. He was tall, as you can see. He's towering over the other people. The newspaper articles routinely had Murphy in the midst of Jewish leaders, including Fred Butzel, who I didn't know anything about Fred Butzel until I started researching for this talk, and he's obviously a big figure in the, there's some scholarships and there's a camp named after him, but here he is in this photo with Frank Murphy. And Murphy protested British restrictions on the Jews entering Palestine. In 1929, he spoke out against anti-Jewish violence in Palestine, the pogroms that happened there. And he was involved with the Jewish community. And just to show you very quickly Murphy's long-running connections to Zionist causes, by 1947, Murphy was a go-to speaker for Zionist causes. This is, we jumped ahead, and after the Holocaust, this is after the Holocaust, 1945, and 1 year before the founding of Israel, and we see Fred Butzel referred to again in here. Murphy is begging off a speaking engagement, but it was clear that he was strongly considering talking at a Zionist cause in Detroit. You can see his handwriting there at the bottom of this. And lady is Eleanor Bumgardner, who was with him for most of his political career. She never got married. As long as he was alive, he lived until 1949. She was at his side the entire time. And there's another gentleman, Edward Kemp, who they're all University of Michigan graduates, and they all supported each other. None of them were married, and they all ended up in the same place at the same time throughout Murphy's career. And my book gets into that a little bit, but maybe we'll have time to address that as well. Keep in mind that, though, that Eleanor lady is Eleanor Bumgardner. She was actually young, but she got the reputation, her name was Lady. Okay, so remember that Murphy at this time, we're again talking 1920s, Murphy was a criminal court judge in Detroit during Prohibition. And there's a problem here because Murphy really enjoyed the nightlife. He was a teetotaler, he didn't drink. His mom told him that he shouldn't drink, and so he didn't. But he enjoyed the nightlife. He liked going out and being seen. And there's a question of how Murphy skated through the nightclub scene while he was at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Again, he's prosecuting Prohibition, and how he's keeping his reputation intact. Here, Murphy may have had contact with another Jewish group. It's likely they did, the Purple Gang, and Frank Murphy would have had contact with the mob, although obviously this is not a well-documented part of his life for obvious reasons. He wouldn't have advertised it. But he learned the value of discretion during his time in Prohibition, along with otherwise law-abiding citizens who wanted to drink and go to nightclubs. They learned how to leave what happens in the nightclubs and what happened during the day, whatever their job was. They continued along without reference to what was going on at night. The Detroit Vice Squad was very active, and there's no record that he was ever arrested in any of these nightclubs or arrested for any other activities. So this is the Detroit River, and we're getting some cold weather now. I understand Detroit is getting cold in New York as well, but the river obviously is the border for Canada. Canada did not have Prohibition, and the river is about 70 miles long, and it's not that wide, especially when it freezes over. So there would be alcohol runs from Canada, which we sometimes associate with stodginess today, but back then it didn't have Prohibition. And this is a photo of a truck that got stuck on the Detroit River as it was bringing alcohol across. And so we'll just talk about gangsters, Jewish gangsters in Detroit, because that's always a fun thing to talk about, and which I couldn't resist posting. This is according to the Detroit Historical Society, some theories as to how the Purple Gang got its its name, and these are just some theories about it. And I'm sure some of you have a lot more background on the Purple Gang than I do, but they were involved with illegal alcohol and numbers games and everything else, and Murphy would have dealt with them in the criminal court system. So Murphy is best known in Detroit for the Asean suite trials that took place. And I could spend hours talking about this trial, which is a fascinating trial. It's the Asean suite house is in Detroit, and it was a famous civil rights case. And I don't know if we can post that poll. I don't. I want to give a little bit of background here. Detroit was a segregated city, and Blacks were not allowed to live in certain neighborhoods, and the juries tended to be all white. So in this in the Asean suite trial, Asean suite was a doctor, a Black doctor, who moved into a white part of Detroit, and mobs would surround him. White mobs would surround him on a nightly basis, and his family was threatened. Rock was thrown through windows. A shot rang out from Asean suite's house and killed a white bystander. That white bystander the Blacks were arrested for shooting out of the house. 9 Blacks, Asean suite, the doctor, along with his brother and friends, and his wife for that matter as well. They were all arrested and tried for murder. And Frank Murphy was a young judge at the time, in criminal court judge. He was told that he didn't have to take the case, but he wanted to do it. It tied into a sense of optimism and idealism. And the jury was all white in a segregated city. So I'm going to ask you what happened. If you know, that's great, and you can answer the way you think is appropriate. But what do you think would be the result of a trial of Black defendants who shot into a crowd and killed a white bystander in a segregated city where the jury is all white? Guilty or not guilty? And we'll let you guys answer if you have the fortitude to do that. We'll give it one more minute. So I have more people finding him guilty than not guilty. And he was found the jury refused to convict. And Frank Murphy got a lot of credit in the Black community for conducting a fair trial. One thing that Frank Murphy allowed Asean suite to talk about the trial was that Asean suite was part of the Great Migration from the South that came up to Detroit, and he was allowed to talk about how he saw lynching when he was a child, and the fear that he had when white crowds were surrounding his house and his right to live in the house. So Frank Murphy told the jury that he had no duty to retreat from his house. It was his house. He has a right to live wherever he wants, and that they had to put themselves in his shoes. This is the way Frank Murphy spoke to people. And he directed the jury that they have to put themselves in the shoes of a Black person who is feeling threatened by a white crowd. And every man's house is his castle. You've heard that phrase before. It was used in this trial. Clarence Darrow, the famous trial attorney, represented Asean suite and his brothers. And so he was found not guilty by the jury twice, and they refused to convict. And this was seen as a landmark case. The NAACP was immensely interested in this case. It was, from this case, they concluded that they could get some justice before judges and juries in white America. And it really may have changed the trajectory of how the NAACP pursued civil rights. They thought that they could use the courts a little bit more than maybe they did before this trial. And I argue in my book that it does lead to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, indirectly at least. So let me just, so we have our final tally is guilty. More people thought he would have been found guilty, and I'm telling you that he was innocent, found innocent. Actually, he was found, the jury was a hung jury, but effectively they were all found to be innocent of this. They had a right to live in their house. And so now Murphy was a hero in the Black community, and he would use that to his advantage. We're already seeing how he was building himself up in the Jewish community. He was doing that in other communities, and he was getting a reputation of helping minorities and the oppressed generally. So let me I don't know if we can remove this or if that's still on the screen. I don't know if people saw that or not, but more people voted that he was guilty than not guilty, which was not the outcome of this trial. So this is Garland and Charlie Bow in Detroit. This is a Google Maps. And January 6th is coming up. I'm not going to talk too much about the mobs that surrounded the Capitol. That's not what this talk is about. But I'll just say that when you use the word mobs, it's hard to describe exactly how many people are in a mob. There are people standing by, there's people who are active, there's people throwing rocks. But you can, this is where the Sweets live, and it's a place you can visit today. And you could just imagine 1,000 people milling about outside this, and what the fear might be of the Blacks living inside it. And again, Murphy was outraged by this and said everybody has a right to live where they want to. Let me just play around if this works. Okay, so let's just move around the neighborhood a little bit here. And I'm looking at our time. We've got 3 sessions here, and I've got other things to cover, obviously, but to the extent I don't cover everything I wanted to today, we can cover it in the next. This is just showing the general neighborhood, and you could just imagine crowds all around this. So the shots rang out from the 2nd floor up here, and there's a little plaque up of it. Okay, and this is me. I was able to visit Daniel Baxter, who lives in this house right now, and it's a house that you can visit in Detroit if you want as well. Okay, so Murphy is now getting more involved with ethnic communities, including Jews, and he's the Jewish press was active in Detroit, and Jews had their own newspapers, and some were in Yiddish and others were in English. It's clear that the Jewish community had a great deal of respect for Murphy. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Jewish press was focused on local events, reporting weddings and synagogue openings, but also happenings affecting the larger Jewish world. There was obviously a growing concern about events overseas, the pogroms in Russia and the Pale, and the growing fascist threats. But there was also a concern about the direction of our country, the United States. The US had passed anti-immigration laws in 1924, which greatly curtailed immigration and was targeted in many ways against Jews. The unwashed Jews coming from the Pale in Eastern Europe, they created a plan that lowered the existing quota from 3 to 2% of foreign-born populations, basically stopping all Jewish immigration after 1924. And I should add here, because we're gonna talk about Japanese Americans as well, that there was a bigoted horse trading that got this 1924 law passed. The California senators did not want Japanese Americans coming into California, so they agreed to vote for these restrictions, the anti-immigration laws, if Japanese Americans were banned completely from any immigration, which Congress didn't really have a problem with at the time. The end result was a very restrictive immigration act that stopped all Jewish immigration to the country. It had vast consequences as World War II approached. Jews could not get into this country from places where they were in peril. And that was a direct result of the 1924 Immigration Act. But Murphy joined other ethnic groups, Jews and others, to organize to protect foreign workers, because Congress actually wanted to go further. They wanted to start putting taxes on aliens. They would call them aliens. We wouldn't use that word today. And there was an effort to try to protect immigration. So you can see here that the Jewish press was very much impressed with how Frank Murphy was involved with this, trying to help immigrations. And he did things like he taught at a law school in Detroit that had mostly immigrants, first generation lawyers. He thought that was important to teach there so that these people would be a firmer part of the United States. And so Democrats traditionally never won important office. I'm going to talk for maybe 10 more minutes here and maybe take some questions. And we'll carry on at the next talk as well. Democrats traditionally never won important offices in Michigan or Detroit before the 1920s. It wasn't universally true, but it was generally true. And Pingree, who many of you know is the model mayor of Detroit, he was a Republican, and he did things like fix the public streets, which caught on fire at times. So he fixed that as a problem. We think we have problems with infrastructure today. Back then, the streets would catch on fire for various reasons. And Democrats sensed an opportunity in 1929. So we're entering the Great Depression, 1929, and Murphy is a criminal court judge. He's going to run for mayor in a traditionally Republican city of Detroit. Detroit was the third largest or fourth largest city in the country at the time. It was a major industrial powerhouse. It was down on its knees with the Great Depression, and Democrats sensed an opportunity. So he was a young dynamic candidate. They ran him. There was a scandal involving the Republican incumbent mayor, and so he won the mayorship in 1929. It's like a booby prize because you're dealing with a city that didn't have enough revenue and everything else, but nevertheless he won. This photo is of him, and you guys can probably know where this is. This is the Detroit Zoo. There's a train that runs through the Detroit Zoo, and he's riding on it. He was a great publicist for himself, so he enjoyed doing these sort of publicity stunts. So Murphy won the Detroit mayor position in 1930. Again, the city was the fourth largest city in the country and had a larger population than 18 states put together, not put together, but 18 states, including Florida. So it was also in profound economic trouble, and it was a city of 1.5 million, bigger than today in numbers and proportion for the country. It had about 120,000 unemployed in the city, and the city's budget was wrecked because it was based on property taxes, and property could not be sold, so tax revenue from property was going down. Murphy would become a big supporter of the New Deal and federal intervention, but this came after trying other methods to dig his city out of a financial hole. He was a good promoter, as I said. So this is in the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel. It had just opened up when he became mayor. He had zero to do with it, but here you can see him in the tunnel meeting the Canadian mayor of Windsor, right in the middle. And he was, again, a good self-promoter. And he would become a great supporter of federal infrastructure projects. So Murphy's Detroit was a place of starvation and lack of safety nets, with little help for individuals from the state or federal government. And Murphy just fished around furiously for solutions to help the starving and the needy. And the federal government was not involved. There was no Social Security, there was no unemployment, and people were literally starving in the streets of Detroit in a way that it's hard to understand today. So Murphy, one of his ideas was to convert some of the factories into homes. And this is a famous photo of him. It's almost Christ-like as he's eating porridge with the unemployed in the Fisher Lodge. It was the Fisher factory plant in Detroit. And he's becoming a big hero of laborers and working people. And so again, there were kosher kitchens in Detroit, and Murphy always supported creative ways of getting food into people's bodies. So he came out in favor of kosher kitchens. He was energetic in endorsing these ad hoc measures to address hunger. These were run-ups to the New Deal. Jews and Catholics in Detroit, they found common cause because, as I mentioned, Southern whites were coming up. The KKK was strong in Detroit. It was extremely strong, and in Michigan, and it was attacking Murphy as mayor. It was saying that he is a foreigner and that he's anti-Christian, and the Jewish community got behind him because they recognized that it was a common threat against Catholics and Jews, and he was defended by them, and this had an effect on him. He never forgot anybody who did him a favor, and he was always a supporter of the Jews after this and found common cause with them. So we have to address Henry Ford, and Henry Ford is obviously an outside figure in Detroit, and he was known very well to Murphy. The two of them were obviously in touch with each other, and especially when Murphy was the mayor. Racism and anti-Semitism were common features of the American cultural landscape in the 20th century, but this was particularly true in Detroit. Father Charles Cochlin had his national radio broadcasts on the outskirts of Detroit. Henry Ford had his anti-Jewish newspaper in Dearborn, and there was a Black Legion, other people involved. Those who know Henry Ford may not know about his anti-Semitic views. I'm talking to people who probably do. So he's of course known for the introduction of mass production to the auto industry. And I do remember from high school history classes that he paid a good wage. That was what we were told, and his employees were able to go out and buy the cars, and the middle class developed. But his story was more complex than that. He wouldn't hire Jews. He was anti-union, and Murphy and him often clashed. He didn't think the government should be involved with helping the poor. That's something that they should bring them up by their own bootstraps. They should work on their own, and they went after each other. So Ford would do exposés. Murphy would devote a large part of Detroit's budget to welfare, helping families to feed themselves, and Ford would expose if someone was actually working and they were getting money from Detroit. He would publicize that in the newspapers and to try to make Murphy look bad and to try to end this help from the government to the poor, who again he thought should be helping themselves. And you can see there are echoes to that in today as well. There's different people have different views on that, but they got very angry at each other. Just to note what Murphy was doing, by 1930, Detroit accounted for more than 25% of the public general relief dispense in the United States. So Detroit was an outsized place under Murphy to give aid to people who were unemployed. And the numbers are really staggering. And again, it was before the federal government got involved with this. So I'm just going to address the Ford hunger marches. These are all fascinating parts of our history. that all happened in Detroit and the Detroit outskirts. There was a hunger march because, again, the federal government wasn't involved, and a whole bunch of people were laid off by the car companies. And there was a sense that the car companies, who were still making profits, needed to help hire people. They needed to give people jobs. And there was what's called the Ford Hunger March of 1932, started in Detroit. Murphy was the mayor. He allowed it to happen. As soon as they hit the border of Dearborn, which is the headquarters of Ford, everything changed. And so we had Ford dying in a riot in Dearborn as they approached these workers. They were approaching the employment office of the River Rouge Ford plant. And you could see from this headline that they're calling it a riot. You could see the word red in there. Murder charges asked after red mob fights police. And that's the way it was portrayed in the newspaper. And this is going to be a complicated area that Murphy needs to navigate into the future. The unions, there was communist influence in the unions, and we're going to hear about that with Maurice Sugar when we get to him. But there were also a lot of other influences on unions, and Catholics in particular hated, theologically, they were opposed to communism. That's almost universally true. For Murphy, as well as FDR, you'll never hear them use Marxist terminology, but you should note that this was a complicated situation that where there was a lot of emotions on both sides, and our country could have really gone in a different direction if people started fighting back and forth and shooting at each other. That didn't happen back at that time, other than in limited circumstances like this. So I think, Kara, you can tell me if now is a good time to stop.
I think this is a great stopping point for tonight, and we can take, I know we have one question that's coming in.
Okay.
We have a question from Thea Glixman, who said, how much did your research reflect the late University of Michigan professor Sidney Fine's monumental 3-volume biography of Frank Murphy?
Yeah, that is a great question. And actually, I sent an email to Kara. He actually spoke before this very group 40 years ago. I found a reference where he spoke. So for those of you who don't know Sidney Fine, he wrote a monumental work on Frank Murphy. And I regret that I started this project too late. He passed away probably about 10 years ago, Sidney Fine. He was a University of Michigan professor. And yes, I relied on the book at times. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. Anytime I looked at something in the archives and then checked the book to see what he had written about it, his research tended to be impeccable. You know, there's a lot of footnotes in everybody's books when they write a book like this. And it's very rare that people actually go back and check. I had the occasion to do that because I was doing research for my book. And it was a monumental work. Nevertheless, I would say that he was a man of his times. He didn't address certain issues. He addressed some in a different way. And so I didn't want to reinvent the wheel with him, but yes, he's a central figure in this.
If there are any other questions, please submit them now via the chat. We'll just wait for a second to see if anybody else submits questions.
And while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I'll just say this. We'll proceed sort of chronologically with his life, and I want to address his connections to 3 Jewish figures, two of whom are Michigan Jewish figures, and one is more of a national figure. Mira Wolfgang was a labor organizer. Some of you may have met her. She was active right into the 1970s, maybe as a child in Detroit and Michigan area. She was involved with labor issues, and Maurice Sugar, I've been referring to him as well. So I want to refer to the UAW head who had a lot of connections with Murphy. And then I want to address Felix Frankfurter as well, who was a Supreme Court justice. And Murphy and Frankfurter were the two ethnic Supreme Court justices, Murphy being the Catholic and Frankfurter being the Jewish Supreme Court justice. And that they fought with each other through their cases on what an ideal America was like. And I want to get into that as well. So Kara, did any other questions come through?
I didn't see any other questions come through. So let's just say good night for now. We'll see everybody next week on January 12th at 7 p.m. Again, you can use that same link. And thank you, Greg, for a wonderful introduction to Frank Murphy this evening. And we will see everyone next week. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you again.
Take care.